As Erica said, I'm the CAO at Alliance. Alliance is a network of charter schools here in Los Angeles. We run 10 middle schools and 18 high schools across the city, serving approximately 13,000 scholars. We have about 700 or so teachers, and in a home office of about 150 folks. So I appreciate the opportunity of sharing this with you. I am by no means an expert in any of this. Like all of you, trusted into the situation where we had to very quickly figure out what distance learning would look like for us. So I'm happy to answer your questions, but do it very humbly. I'm also here at home with my dog, who is a barker. So while I have a lot of treats with me to hold him over, I apologize in advance if there's some barking in the background. So I thought I would get started with just a little bit of context in terms of our timeline. We announced school closure on the 13th, and we announced it on the 13th. And sent scholars home with work packets and where we have them devices. We've been very privileged to have almost one-to-one scholar to device access for most of Alliance's history. During that last final day or so of school, we conducted a scholar Wi-Fi survey to get a sense of how many scholars did not have Wi-Fi at home. We also posted work packets on the Alliance website so parents and families could download those packets in case schools weren't able to print copies before the end of the day. We have, for the last 2 weeks, been closed. The only folks working have been essential school staff. That includes the principal and then anyone else on their team that they deemed essential, and home office employees, including the academic team and the schools team, which have been the two teams on our end who have been leading the distance learning efforts. From the 16th through the 20th, we formed a distance learning working group and built out the guidance and resources that I'm going to share with you today. We shared those resources and plans with school leaders on the 23rd so that they could get a preview of the guidance that we were sharing. And then we had a district learning training for leaders on the 25th and 26th. Today is our teacher planning day. This is led by school sites with support from the home office. And then tomorrow, distance learning launches with our scholars. So it's been a fast and furious couple of weeks. And then on the right, I just included some of the meeting and communication structures that have been really helpful to us, both in getting the work done, but also in communicating with our principals, our staff, and our families. What I'm going to show you today is just some of the resources that we've built out around the model that we have. We made a decision very early on that we were going to run an asynchronous distance learning model, meaning that we would not have live teaching happening. We did this for a number of reasons. The first being that we did not feel confident in scholars' access to Wi-Fi. And second, that we knew that many of our teachers were juggling personal responsibilities on top of their work responsibilities, and asking them to be on at particular and specific times of the day would be quite difficult for many of them. Third, that we have many students who are older and have multiple responsibilities at home beyond school, particularly at this time. And again, having flexibility in when they could access coursework and do their course and task was going to be important for this to be a feasible model for them. We also made a decision pretty early on to use Google Classroom as our primary learning platform. Google Classroom had already been widely used across the network by most of our teachers, and so it would not require a great amount of training on our end. The distance learning working group, which was a group of folks from the academic team and the schools team at the home office, met and pulled together a plan to get from 0 to all of the resources in about 7 days. And one of the first things we did is we aligned on our vision for district for distance learning, which you'll see here, which is around consistency, connection, compassion, and readiness. And these were really important for us to align on because it helped us then have a clear sort of set of principles to build our resources and model around. It also gave us some language to talk about where we made specific decisions and why. And many of our schools then adopted and adapted these principles so that they were really clear on their why for distance learning when they shared it with their staff. The document that's linked here is our OneStop Shop document for leaders. This is the document that we shared with leaders on that Monday right before training. I'm going to click into it now, which I hope you can see it. We've made most of the links available to you if you'd like to peruse. There are some links that we've kept private, but most of them should give you access. But you'll see that we provided guidance to leaders around course offerings, expectation setting, teacher guidance, launching, what week 0 should look like, school supports, Google Classroom and technical guidance, and then family communication. And I'll walk through a number of these with you guys in a couple of minutes. So we gave guidance to leaders around course offerings. That was the first set of guidance we gave them. And we recommended that there were fewer courses that would be offered during distance learning, up to leader discretion. But we recommended math, science, and ELA in middle school, and then a prioritized set of A through G courses in high school. And we shared with them some sampling weekly schedules, a way to really think about what asynchronous would look like. This included required work and engagement by scholars, optional work, and then teacher weekly responsibilities. We then also included a teacher guidance for distance learning. This is the OneStop teacher guidance shop for teachers. And I'll walk through some of this with you because it outlines the actual instructional model that we've adopted. So the elements of the Alliance District learning model include, for every course that we're offering, a learning launch, which is a teacher-directed lesson, a video that is either curated from the internet or a teacher videos and records on their own that's shared with students. Our recommendation is that there's 2 lessons per week with some differing time allocations for the sort of amount or how long each video lesson is. That learning launch should be driven by standards aligned objectives, just like any other lesson. Then there should be assignments that are aligned to those lessons that are given to scholars, at least 2 assignments per week, again, assigned through Google Classroom. Again, there are some recommendations in terms of number of minutes of estimated scholar work time per assignment. Because connection and relationships are really important to us during this time, office hours and small group instruction are a key part of the model. We have recommendations around the amount of hours per week. And then we have some optional independent learning, self-paced learning that we're recommending that scholars can engage in. That's up to school and teacher discretion. We're using advisory as a time to check in with scholars 101 and post beginning of week and end of week morning messages. And then we have some pieces around grading and teacher prep time. So this is really the core of the instructional part of the model. And in this document, beyond this, you'll see that we included an overview of teacher responsibilities, including for RSP and ELD teachers, sample schedules for scholars and for teachers. And then a lot of guidance around assignments, around supporting diverse learners, involving families, launching week 0. And then we've built Google Classrooms for teachers, which are instructional resources. So it's essentially allowing teachers across the network to collaborate across different content areas and grades. And those are facilitated by our team. We've also been building some content specific guidance. So how does that model that I shared with you look like in ELA, math, science, ELD, and special education? So I'll just show you ELA. For ELA, we use Springboard or Expeditionary Learning as our curriculum, or HMH as our curriculum in school, but we made the decision to switch to CommonLit because of the features that it has that we think are going to translate into more successful online learning for scholars. And so you'll see that in the ELA guidance, now you see what we shared in a more content agnostic version of the elements of the model in a very specific version for what it looks like for ELA. So you'll see the video, the lesson assignments, etc. And then we've been working on building out modified scope and sequences for each grade. We're doing this in ELA, math, and science. And we made decisions on the modified scope and sequence based on 2 things. One is data that we had from the ICA that we did in March for middle school and December for high school, as well as our interim 3 assessments, which we were in the middle of conducting when closure happened. And then also looking at unfinished learning for the year. So what was the highest priority standards or content that we had yet to cover that we felt were critical for scholars to have access to in order to be successful in their next grade. So if you click on 6th grade ELA, it then tells you for every week a modified scope and sequence, including sample materials, tasks, culminating questions, etc. And so we'll be working on these. We're essentially 2 weeks ahead or so. So we're working on content specific resources, you know, as the work evolves. I just wanted to also pull up our SPED guidance. There is some guidance both for instruction and how we recommend RSP and instructional aides use their time and support scholars, including a list of key responsibilities and resources for them. A set of priorities for the first 2 weeks, which we expect to be very compliance heavy. Sample schedules for RSP teachers, supporting scholars on the alternate curriculum. There is a portion of guidance that we've shared also around compliance, which we didn't include here because it is ever changing, as all of you know, and I'm happy to answer some questions there if you'd like. Today was our planning day, so we had a planning day sample agenda, which I'll share in a minute. And we gave this to leaders so that they could use it as a starting point for their planning. And from what I've heard, it's gone well. So the planning day at school sites today looked like some version of this. So welcoming back with a team builder, sharing school-based information. Then we pre-recorded a number of videos, both from content and technology, that walked folks through a number of resources that we had built at the home office. This afternoon, we held office hours across different teams. So I facilitated an office hour for all of our advanced placement teachers to answer their questions around exams that are coming up. And then there's planning time in a team huddle. So schools really adapted this to fit their sites, but it looked like some version of this today. We also shared with leaders, there's so much going on, so much coming at you. So we wanted to give them some guidance on what to do before distance learning started. So last week, what to prioritize, and then what to prioritize this week. So for last week, it was around determining courses, staff roles and responsibilities, weekly expectations, attendance, which I didn't go into, but we have some guidance there that was informed by our good friends at Ednovate and their really amazing work. And then parent and student communication. And then for this week, welcoming scholars back, planning more frequent check-ins and planning ongoing team huddles. And 101s, those are the priority there. We also talked to them about what to progress monitor. So for these first 3 days, attendance being the number one thing. We want to make sure that we have our scholars coming to virtual school, problem solving around Wi-Fi, and then making sure that there is individual touch points with each scholar. And then after spring break, so we have 3 days of distance learning, then we have spring break, and then we come back, really prioritizing attendance check-ins, material uploads, assignment submission rates, and percentage of scholars with individual touch points. So I'm sure these will evolve as we do this work, but we really wanted to make sure that they were prioritizing a small, narrow set of indicators to help them know that distance learning was up and running. And I think once we move past that week 1, we'll start paying more attention to scholar success on assignments and scholar learning outcomes. Finally, we talked to them, we shared with them ideas around check-ins, whole school meetings. We've been really clear with them that we think this is a time to slow down and to prioritize. So continuing performance management routines or instructional cycles like data meetings and intellectual prep are things that are up to a principal's discretion, but we would suggest that the time to start those things back up would be after week 1, after that week after spring break. And then we provided a lot of technical guidance. As I said, the transition to Google Classroom isn't a huge lift for most of our teachers, but it is to some. So we built out tech guidance for teachers, to teachers, for teachers to share with students, and then for scholars and their families to use at home. And then finally, we talked about family communication. We gave some resources around how to share information with families. We're right now rebuilding the Alliance Coronavirus page to include all of our resources around distance learning. That should be launched by the end of today. And then we just did some tips around ongoing communication structures. All of our schools are updating their individual school websites with Google Classroom pages and codes for all of the courses that they're offering, making sure that there's very clear content information, and making sure that there's a staff available for translation. So that's the last slide I had. I wanted to make sure that we saved the majority of our time for Q&A, but I'm happy to dig into any of the resources that I moved more quickly through, and happy to answer your questions.
Great, thank you, Anna. We've had a couple questions come in about how folks can access these materials. I know we can share out this PowerPoint. Is there any other info you have about where these materials come from and how folks can access them?
Yeah, so we'll share the deck with you all, and most of the materials, the materials are linked in there. There are a few that there won't be access, but most of them there will be, almost all of them. And we also will be posting a number of these on the External Alliance website as well.
Great, thank you. And I should have mentioned, if people want to ask questions, you can just type them into the Q&A box and I will unmute you. So I see one question that has come in, says, if we had the opportunity to ask elected officials for support, what would your number one or number two ask be?
That's a good question. I tend to stay out of the politics of all of this. I think that, Wi-Fi access has been an incredibly challenging thing. We were as I said, in a really privileged situation to have device access for most kids, but in our scholar survey, we found that anywhere between 15 to 20% of our scholars did not have access to Wi-Fi. We've been taking advantage of some of the resources that have been made available through Charter and other companies, but that has not resolved all of our issues. We just ended up buying hotspots and now are starting to distribute those. But it's been, a pretty challenging situation. And to me, it's one of equity. We need to make sure that families have access to Wi-Fi. And so I think that's a place where I would want the state or elected officials to play some sort of role if they can.
Great, thank you. Robert asked, when you rolled this out, were your teachers overwhelmed?
That's a good question. So I think that, I think most teachers are overwhelmed in general. This is an overwhelming time. I think all of us are also overwhelmed. We shared all of the materials that I've shared with you, and then leaders really took the initiative to figure out how they were going to share it with their teachers. Most of the leader docs that I've seen were a much slimmer version of what I shared with you. But we erred on the side of being more thorough and more comprehensive, knowing that we wanted to be able to answer as many questions as possible for our leaders, and then they could make decisions about how to share this with schools. The other thing we did is we said to leaders, whatever we share with you at whatever point in this process, there is no secret firewall. You can share it with teachers. And so many of them had actually been sharing things over the course of the last week and a half, so that by the time it got to today, teachers had a good sense of what was happening. We also shared updates on distance learning in all of our all staff emails, with little tidbits of what had been decided. So for example, Google Classroom being the platform that was shared very early on, that it was an asynchronous model, also shared. The elements of the model were shared last week. So we tried to send information out to staff on a rolling basis, so that by the time they got to today, many staff, at least, probably not all, had known some of this information already. I think the reality is that these are overwhelming times, however, so I'm sure that most folks are feeling overwhelmed.
Great. And then James asked, how has your grading policy changed? And if it has, what were the considerations?
Good question. We did provide some guidance around grading. So for courses that are continuing on, during distance learning. We made some very slight adjustments to grading, but for the most part, the policies have remained consistent, with some guidance around how often to grade scholars. And we're building out some guidance right now on assessments, and sort of best practices and assessments in a virtual world. For courses that are not being offered during distance learning, we gave schools a few options. For the most part, for most scholars and schools, that will mean freezing grades at the 10-week mark. And then, assuming and hoping that we get back to school before the end of the year, then we unfreeze and add some additional grades when kids are back together. I think that there is a link in the documents that takes you to some Q&A around grading that also goes into some more specifics.
Great, thank you. And sorry to bombard you with questions. We're having tons come in, so this is great. Ryan asked, Ryan asked, knowing what you know now, is there anything that you would do differently for those of us that are in the beginning planning phase?
Let's see. Yes, I think I would do. That's a good question. I think that the thing that we would probably do somewhat differently, I don't know. That's a good question. So here are the things that I'm thankful that we did. And I think that there were moments in the road where we would have like taken another path. And I'm grateful that for whatever reason, like we didn't. So one, and I talked about this a little earlier, I was very grateful that we sort of made the call early on that like whatever we shared was free to share. And that we had a trickle of information around distance learning being shared almost on a daily with principals. Actually on a daily starting last Wednesday up until today. And that information was also trickling to teachers. I think that had we not done that and had waited to share everything with leaders all at once and everything with teachers all at once, people would have been even more overwhelmed than they are now. And so I was really happy that we made that decision. I would recommend that to folks. I think that there are, I think that the other part that I was happy that we made a decision on was around having modified scope and sequences for teachers and having instructional resources. We're fortunate that we have the capacity to be able to do that. But I think the number one question I've gotten from teachers is like, what do I actually teach now? And what are the resources out there? And I think there are so many amazing, software companies and websites that now have things that are available for free, but no one has the time or patience, quite frankly, to be sifting through all of those to be like, oh, I'm going to do this and this and this. And so I think the more that we can provide a narrow set of resources for teachers, and help them prioritize. I think that they've been very thankful for that. And I think there were moments where we hedged on the amount and level of detail that we would provide, and we've ended up providing more in a fewer number of courses that I think have been the right decision for us at least. So those are two that come to mind, not necessarily things that, I would have done differently, but I think moments in the road where we had some choices. I think I'm having a little bit of a hard time answering because I feel so in it yet. And I haven't had a ton of time to reflect. And so I think if you ask me that in a week or so, once we've had kids and teachers back, I'll probably have a firmer answer because I know that there are lots of things that, we'll reflect and learn from.
That makes sense. Thank you. So Steve asked what you're doing if students ignore your efforts to reach them through distance learning.
I'm sorry, can you ask that one more time?
Yep. What are you doing for students that are ignoring efforts to reach them via distance learning?
Good question. So we haven't had that problem yet because we are starting with kids tomorrow. But I'll tell you a little bit about our attendance policy or sort of process, which is trying to get at that. And I cannot claim any credit for this. We took this from, we had Ednovate share their process with us and we really loved it. And they should be bragging about their attendance because it's been in the 90s in their first week of distance learning. So the way that attendance will work for us is that there's a daily attendance survey that will be sent out. It will be either sent out by the advisory teacher or the person who leads attendance at the school site, sent out at the same time via Google form. And it has a number of questions, including some scholar well-being questions, whether the scholar wants to talk to their advisor that day. It's a wellness check, but it also serves as the attendance survey for the day. And scholars will have a deadline by which they have to submit that survey, say 10 a.m. And then after that, there is like follow-up by either the advisory teacher and office staff or office staff only. Schools are doing it a little bit differently, but that there's actual immediate follow-up with every scholar who does not submit the survey at that specific moment in time. And what we're hoping is that through that personal, individualized follow-up with scholars, that we're able to reach scholars, able to connect and figure out what obstacles may be in their way to engaging and help remove those obstacles. So we haven't started with scholars yet. That's just one of the ways that we're gonna try to account for scholars who have been, who are being harder to reach. We'll know more in a couple of weeks about how that's gonna work.
Thank you. The next question is, how are teachers being held accountable for time or meeting standards?
So I think I have sort of two ways I'm going to answer that. I think the first is there's still 101 check-ins with leaders, and leaders are added as co-teachers on every Google Classroom. So, your 6th grade ELA teacher has their ELA lead, let's say their AP, who is a co-teacher in that classroom. So that AP can see exactly what's going on and can give teachers feedback and make sure that they are doing what they need to be doing or what we've set out or the school has set out as expectations. I'm hoping that the resources that we've shared, which are all standards aligned, are a very good starting point for teachers and can support them in making sure that what they're then providing to scholars is standard aligned. So that's the other way I might answer that. That was one of the reasons that we decided to go deeper into content and to provide as best we could lesson level materials. So that's sort of the more straightforward answer. I think the other part is, these are really, really difficult times for everyone and our teachers included. And so we've been really purposeful in making sure that we are being as compassionate and empathetic as possible, and making sure that we are understanding teachers' personal situations and helping be more flexible. That doesn't mean that they, are allowed to, not allowed is not the right answer, but that, non-standards aligned instruction or not posting lessons when, they're supposed to be posted, that those things are okay. But I think there's a level of understanding, compassion, and flexibility that we need to flex as leaders, because like many of our students, there are probably obstacles or things that they're juggling that are making that difficult. And so our first job is to seek to understand and to help remove those obstacles as much as possible.
Great. I think we have time for about 2 more questions, if that works for you, Anna. Let's do, Valerie asked if you could say more about the transition to CommonLit. Is this something that's new for Alliance, and are you having to train teachers on it?
Great question. So we've had many teachers who have used CommonLit as a supplement, but we have not used it as a core curriculum. And you know, as I've shared, I wouldn't use it as a core curriculum. I don't think it's built to be a core curriculum that you would use every day in school when you see kids face to face. But I think in a virtual environment, there's a lot of pluses to it that make it a better resource than some of the other resources that we've been using that were really built to, you know, happen in person. If you look at the ELA guidance that I opened earlier and that you have access to, there's a ton of resources on how to access CommonLit. We also built some videos to walk teachers through that process. We also had office hours today where teachers could ask questions around that. And we're providing some more support in our Google Classroom for teachers. So I haven't learned of a ton of difficulty from teachers, but to be honest, we're really early in this process too. And so I'm sure we'll learn more in the next couple of days if folks are having trouble.
Great, and let's take one last question. This one's from Vanessa. She asks, what are some of the best practices that Alliance school leaders are finding to maintain relationships with parents?
A great question. I think we're early in this process as well. And so I have a couple that I can share, but I think we'll learn a lot more in the next few days. I think that they found success in varying the communication channels. So we have parent letters that have been going out. We also use Parent Square. We've had pretty consistent cadences of messages through there. Those have been successful. Leaders have also been using social media, particularly like Instagram accounts, to keep in touch with families. Some of them have been hosting or are about to host a virtual sort of coffee with the principal. And we're hoping to get some good turnout out of that. We have been giving guidance and examples about how to make sure that their websites are really clear around resources for parents, and that those resources, including on the Alliance website, are not only academic, but we're providing resources around food and clothing, and access to technology, mental health services. So I think the other best practice is to really look at this holistically, and where possible, make sure that you're providing resources that go beyond instruction, because our families have a lot of different needs, and we are in a position to connect them to resources or organizations that, you know, can support that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Anna. I know that we weren't able to get through all the questions today, but thank you all for being so engaged. And hopefully some of these will get answered once you have time to dig into the resources in the PowerPoint, which we will share in a follow-up email tomorrow that will also have the recording. We also want to plug the fact that based on member surveys, CCSA has heard that topics like community engagement, supporting special education needs, creating online infrastructure, grading student work, and teacher professional development are some of the issues that are coming up the most for leaders. So look out for more info from CCSA about upcoming webinars that are more deep dives on these specific topics. And it's not 100% confirmed yet, but we are planning for a webinar on special education next Tuesday, and likely one on a school climate issue this Friday. So look out for more information on that. And with that, I just want to thank you all for taking time to attend this webinar. When you exit, you'll be auto-directed to a very short survey, just 2 quick questions. We'd really appreciate the feedback as we're working to implement these webinars, and we hope that you and your families stay safe and healthy. Have a great day.